to kick off the webinar series for NZARM. Today I'm going to be talking you through achieving environmental outcomes with a whole farm systems mindset. As Matt said, more than happy to take questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that, and always welcome that. So operating within a whole farm system context does seem like an obvious thing to do, but it is really demonstrated well in policy and regulatory systems, or often in the development of farm plans. And it's not necessarily due to a lack of competence or a desire to do that from those doing the mahi, but it's often from a lack of understanding around some of the complexities or nuances of systems, from a lack of understanding how things interact, or from more often than not from competing objectives or a very specific compliance need. Because farm systems are complex, particularly in the New Zealand system where we're operating in a temperate climate, and most farm systems are unique, primarily because every single human that runs them are unique individuals. This adds to the challenge of delivering farm systems thinking while achieving environmental outcomes. So I'm going to, hopefully, take you through some of the ways that I think about that when I'm dealing with it. So why do we need a farm systems mindset? By and large, farmers want to do the right thing by their land and their water resources. They care for their land. Their land is what generates that income, and that is what supports them to do the things that they want to do in the way of life that they have. It is a key resource for them, and I've yet to meet a farmer that doesn't want to hand their land on in a better state. At the moment, though, regulatory pressure is creating a lot of pain and uncertainty for farmers. The volume that is coming at farmers is somewhat unprecedented. It's often hitting farmers that are not used to the compliance world. So particularly in our sheep and beef and deer sectors, where they haven't had to tackle compliance in any great way. And so that's undermining their confidence to act. And even though we know that often a lot of the things we can do to support positive environmental outcomes are also good for the farm business, if you don't have confidence to act, then less likely to do it. I always think it's quite an accomplishment to get a Metallica quote into a presentation, so I hope those of you that are rock stars appreciate that. If we can take a farm system approach to implementing environmental outcomes, which by and large need people to implement them, then that can help us demonstrate that we understand farmers, and that we are genuinely there to help achieve a shared outcome. It really requires people to be at the centre of the way that we think about things, and if we take that mindset, we're more likely to get positive outcomes quicker. So what is a farm system? So I did actually, when I started to pull this presentation together, I struggled a little bit in terms of thinking, how do I articulate some of these things, because I'm fortunate that farm systems are innate, and due to my upbringing and the path that I've taken. Appreciate that that's not the case for everyone, so I went on a little bit of a hunt to see if I could find some useful definitions. And there are a lot of people who have tried to define a farm system, and there are a lot of quite interesting definitions out there if you need a distraction to manage the Christmas rush at the moment. But I found one that was pretty close to what resonated with me from Jackson et al. In 2001. So they said, a farming system is defined as a complex, interrelated matrix of soil, plants, animals, implement, power, labour, capital, and other inputs controlled in part by farming families and influenced to varying degrees by political, economic, institutional, and social forces that operate at many levels. And I did read that and think, goodness, who'd be a farmer? One of the key things that was missing from that definition was the influence of climate, as I've already covered. And so again, people are at the core of this. So it's the way a person or people manage all of those complexities that generates an outcome from farm systems and will determine whether environmental outcomes are positive or negative. So some work I've been doing with Rabobank this year, we pulled together this little illustration to help kind of demonstrate, I guess, the nature of a farm system. And we use this to think about all of the elements of integrated farm planning, which I think is a really good way to take a farm systems mindset. And I thought I'd share it with you. So thanks to Rabobank for permission. So we obviously start with our natural resources, our soil, topography. I had to have a little homage to Manawatu there with the windmills. We've got water, vegetation, all of the natural resources that make up our farm systems. And these are what we have as our core base to drive some form of production system. And the we are the people. So we have farm owners, farm managers, usually some staff. These people need to live in houses. There are other people that share the resources that we use, such as the water resources. Once we've got our land and natural resources, we add some animals or crops into the system. And that's a choice that's often based on those inherent capabilities of our land, water, and people in terms of what particular farming system we might run. Once we've got animals or crops into our system, we need some infrastructure. We need to think about how those animals are going to move in our environment, what risks the management of them might create. We need to protect our land and our environment and our animals and people from biosecurity risks, and we may need some machinery and implements. All of this is packaged together in a business that we need to run on a daily basis. So it is a complex system, but we can build up the different elements when we're thinking about how we might achieve outcomes. And if we think about the interaction of all of those things, we can get both positive and negative outcomes for the environment. So I've developed this framework, which you're more than welcome to use if it's of use. And I use this for integrated farm planning, for environment planning if it's specific to a topic such as greenhouse gases or water, and also use this as the basis of a good business plan. So we always start with business and family goals and objectives. It's really important to understand what those who are living and breathing and managing the land and the water resources are trying to achieve in the short, medium and long term. By and large, that means that we can anchor our environmental actions back to what they're trying to achieve, and it helps with that system focus and looking for win-wins. So always start with that. The chances of a plan being implemented that are not consistent with those longer term views that farming families have is very low. I then move on to our base resources and constraints. So that's your natural resources, soils, topography, aspect, climate, as well as your human resources and capital resources. So it's important to think about all of those things because that will determine the scope of options that we've got. Also, obviously important to understand constraints. And so that's not just regulatory, but also capital and environmental and often human as well. As an example, on our flat farm, we're fairly well unconstrained by topography, soils, climate, but human capital is a little challenging to come by at the moment. So that does constrain some of the options we've got in terms of how we use that land. Obviously, regulatory constraints in terms of the natural resources we use come in there, and capital constraints are also pretty important in a farm business and farm system context. I've put in that middle box current situation. If this was a greenhouse gas plan, that would be my number and where I'm at with my greenhouse gas number. So it's all of those, that sort of base level of understanding. Where are my risks at? Where have I got scope to move? What am I doing in terms of water quality management? Where am I at with biodiversity resources? So a bit of a stock take as well as an understanding of the state of those resources. Those first three then kind of determine the nature of the options that you might have to respond and the scope that you've got. Sometimes that's a very limited list in terms of options to respond, and it very much is determined by what your requirements are at the farm scale, regional scale and national scale, as well as, again, anchoring back to those short and long-term objectives for the business. Can then, once we've got been through some analysis of those, look at a response and move on from there and into a good planning process, implementing, adapting and reviewing as we go. So if we come back to environmental outcomes, I'm just going to, at the moment, the way we're thinking about that is around water, greenhouse gases and biodiversity. Greenhouse gases, not just mitigation, but also sequestration and, of course, adaptation to climate change. If the world doesn't respond appropriately, New Zealand farming systems will be up for some quite significant changes to our climate and our farming landscape over the next few decades. And I'm not going to get into any detail on this because looking at the list of attendees, this is all in very much in your lanes in terms of knowing what we need to do around environment. But thinking at a farm system level across those three topics, for water, looking at water quantity as well as in reducing that and being efficient with use and enhancing water quality, reducing greenhouse gases where possible, and that's driven primarily by feed eaten, and that's a particular challenge to achieve a farm system response. Often our options to reduce emissions in one part of the farm may increase them in others due to that impact of quantity of feed eaten, and of course adaptation, as I've talked about, and then protecting and enhancing any biodiversity assets that we might have in our farming systems. Something that comes up often when we're talking about achieving environmental outcomes on farm is that they need to be practical, which is often ill-defined or not defined at all. And again, I actually had to think quite hard about how to define it. So I did a wee Google, and this one came up as likely to succeed or be effective in real circumstances, which I thought was pretty clear and feasible as well. If I translated that into what a farmer might articulate as practical, the options or actions that we put forward need to be consistent with the landscape. And I have deliberately chosen a fence for the image here because that's often one where practical conflicts with rules, regulations or approaches. Affordable, and again, that can be very challenging in terms of the outcomes that we're looking for versus the situation of the particular farmer that we're dealing with. And also can be integrated into farming practices. And a key point here is that it's not necessarily that no change in farming practices or farming systems is required, but that farmers can see how they could adapt their farming practices to incorporate the action or option that's been put on the table. And admittedly, and sometimes, not just sometimes, but frequently, the fact that options are not practical is used as an excuse for inaction. And that does often require a little bit of creativity to navigate. So how do we make options and actions practical? A key challenge is that the definition of practical is subjective and will be different for different people. And I'm sure we could have a good debate about that for a couple of hours in terms of where that might land. So what that does mean is if you're working with a farmer to achieve environmental outcomes, you're probably going to need to negotiate in terms of what practical might look like. I like to focus on the outcome, and in my experience, farmers are very creative, and if they understand why they need to act and the outcome that's trying to be achieved, they can usually figure out a way to get through that. And so work with their knowledge and understanding. They live and breathe their landscapes and their environment, and if they know what they're trying to achieve, will often be able to find a way through without with your support rather than your directive. Linking back to the objectives can be very valuable as well. So again, coming back to what are those short, medium and long-term goals. Knowing if there's multiple options to achieve an outcome, and fencing of waterways is a really, really good example where there are lots and lots of ways of achieving the same outcome in terms of enhanced water quality. And it's really important to know what you're trying to achieve with a fence. So is it that you're trying to get stock out, in which case a fence is probably going to be your best option, but there may be other options there, such as appropriate stock water reticulation, or is it that you're trying to manage other contaminants which maybe can be managed before they actually get to a fenced off area, such as sediment? Are you better to do the erosion control where the erosion could be happening rather than try and prevent it getting into the water when it's already occurred? Understanding what great would look like, and if you're going to implement great, what could be compromised in the system. And again, if you're looking at a fence like the one I just put up, full batten fence, that's a very expensive type of fence. You might think that's great from a compliance perspective or from an outcome perspective, but is it, again, coming back to the outcome, is there a way of doing something much less expensive that could still achieve the outcome and actually get everyone on board? And I've seen some really good examples of that. Waratahs with a couple of barbed wire. Most farmers hate barbed wire, but was very effective in that particular landscape. Polyrods in a single hot wire, also a very effective method of getting stock out. And once the farmer could afford it, putting in a much more comprehensive fence, if you like. Also thinking about what else you're trying to achieve and what that could benefit in terms of the broader system or other environmental components, the time frame that you're trying to work to, and options that might exist to stage implementation. Again, that polyrod example is a good one where that system sat in place for 3 years, and then after 3 years, that particular creek was fenced off properly. Culverts put in, and so the outcome was achieved immediately, maybe not quite as great as you would have liked, but it was better than nothing at all. Risk management comes into pretty much every farm planning approach or for people working in terms of achieving environmental outcomes on farm. The likelihood and impact approach to risk management is a really good start, and it is a useful way for farmers to kind of think about the impact of risk. From my perspective, there's 2 types of risk when we're dealing with environmental outcomes. The first is inherent, so driven by things like soil type, topography, and so soil erosion, for example, is often inherent, but then management has a big impact on how much that could be an issue. So the type of stock that are managed on a particular landscape, the way that covers are managed, for example, the vegetation cover, which parts of the farm have been intensively managed versus extensively. We often focus in farm planning on the inherent risk because it's very easy to focus on what's there and what's not arguable, whereas management can require a lot more in-depth conversations to actually understand where risks might be occurring. But actually, a lot of our environmental risks are driven by the way that we manage our animals and our cropping and nutrient practices, and we can do a lot of good by helping farmers understand where those risks are created, and often the win-wins are there in terms of more efficient resource use, leading to better environmental outcomes and also better business outcomes. The other challenge that I've seen in terms of using just a risk management approach is that people focus on the medium high or the high end of the matrix, and often that can be the really hard stuff to deal with. So while it might be the biggest risk and have the greatest impact, and is highly likely of occurring, it can be the stuff that's quite hard to overcome. And as I said, there are often some things we can do in our farming systems that can make quite a big difference, that may be in the low to medium risk matrix area. If we can support our farmers to deal with those, often that can help build confidence. And as I said at the start, we've got farmers losing confidence and taking action. And if we can get some runs on the board and some simple outcomes where you take an action, outcome occurs, it's visual, it didn't cost much, it didn't take much time or effort, builds confidence for them to keep going. So I do am careful about just focusing on using the risk matrix and actually thinking about what are we trying to achieve here, and are there some other small things that we could do that will build that confidence and keep farmers engaged with looking after their environment. I use all of the approach in terms of prioritising how I will tackle particular tasks. So the way I prioritise is firstly, what do I need to do to meet compliance? Obviously, I want to be making sure that my clients and farmers I'm working with are not breaching any compliance. So that's my first priority. Second would be something that's soon to be compliance. So if I know that there's some pending regulations, and intensive winter grazing is a good one, you'd hope that we're all having proactive discussions with people around intensive winter grazing before it was actually came into play. And then I'll look at the high risk or easy to do, and again, depending on where those risk areas lie, and whether there's some easy wins and we need to build confidence. And then my fourth priority is what farmers want to do. And almost every farmer that I've met where we've talked about their objectives right at the start, they've got a project or two that they want to do. It might be restoring a wetland, or retiring an area, or doing some planting or enhancement on a dam, or there's all sorts of those kind of pet projects, if you like. And I often remind farmers that, that they're in this, it's their life and their playground as well. And if it's going to make you happy, then make sure you do some work on those pet projects and not just focus on your compliance requirements. And that really does help, again, with building confidence and, I guess, bringing some joy back into natural resource management. Thinking about systems as well, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we do need to think about any actions that we're doing and what the consequences of those might be. And how people respond to that is key here. So what are the consequences of the action? And I've got a couple of examples that I'll show you from these two images. Are there challenges created elsewhere in the system? And we may see some of this starting to rear its head as pricing on greenhouse gases comes on, that farmers are responding to greenhouse gas mitigation, which potentially could lead to detrimental outcomes for water, for example. So just an example, which I think I've talked to a couple of you about, is the way we do erosion planting with poplars and willows. If you start planting for meeting ETS forest definition, that can sometimes be at the expense of soil erosion outcomes, not always, but sometimes. And it may just be that areas get missed because you're busy trying to create a large enough area elsewhere. And so, yeah, there is going to sometimes be a trade-off. If we've got trade-offs, we need to then make a call or look at how we might be able to mitigate some of the impact of that. And we do need to also always come back to what's the human capacity and capability in the system. And so just a couple of examples here. Finishing lambs earlier is a good thing from a greenhouse gas perspective, but if you then get your lambs off earlier and then bring in another stock class to utilise the feed that you've got left over, if you like, because you've managed to get lambs off early and suddenly you've got a feed surplus that you're trying to use, that can actually lead to more greenhouse gases overall. So that's one potential consequence there. And this top example is up in Gizzy, and this river, I think, was fenced off 3 or 4 times, and every time it got fenced off, the river resettled and removed as the dynamics of the river changed with the having stock and out of that waterway. And so even though there was quite big margins, the consequences were that kept moving. I think if they'd talked to a river engineer, they might have figured that out earlier. But it is important to understand what might happen when we implement these changes. So some other, I guess, broader examples of how we can achieve win-wins. On the left there is our hill country farm, and we purchased that in 2013 with about 20 paddocks, hardly any trees on the place. Actually, ironically, in this picture, most of the trees in here were on it in 2013 when we purchased it. And really needed some work to make it hum and make it perform, but also had some really pretty big environmental objectives. There's some beautiful patches of original kahikatea on the property, and 3 fairly significant waterways that we wanted to protect so that we could enjoy this piece of land with our families and staff families, recreationally, as well as generating a business out of it. So we've invested about $1 million of capital into it in terms of a stock water reticulation system. I think we're up to about 60 paddocks now, so a lot of fencing's gone in. What we did was utilise the waterways, which are in the bottom of the 3 valleys that we cover, as fencing those off then meant we could use those fences to subdivide the better land. We've retired areas of bush out away from grazing, and so we're really focusing on the land classes that can handle greater intensity of stock, and then taken all the areas that are more vulnerable out of the system. As a consequence, the farm has improved profitability quite substantially. I think we haven't done a whole lot of measurement, but environmental outcomes have improved. We certainly see a lot more native birds. We're seeing native fish in our waterways, and we're all spending more time there recreationally as well. One of the consequences of all of that is our greenhouse gas emissions have gone up quite a lot. Our intensity's gone down, but our total emissions have gone up. So that's our next challenge to tackle, is how we respond to the greenhouse gas challenge. And the one on the right there is a wetland development down south. This catchment is actually, as it happens, catches about 80% of this particular property, and that little valley is a historic wetland. This is in an area where there's very few wetlands left, like most of the country, but particularly this area. And so protecting this area, we've managed to not just restore a wetland, but also look at fencing much more strategically, so stock move much better through this area. basically the two ridges that you can see on either side of that photo have been fenced, and then there's also carbon planting gone into there, not pine trees, I'll add, but natives. So we're getting some long-term carbon generation from natives, enhanced biodiversity, restoring the wetland, and getting better stock movement. So we've taken a very much a systems approach, and that wetland filters 80% of the runoff from that property, which is pretty cool. Just another example, and I see there's some whole farm planners in our company today. Coming back to the knowing what our base resources and constraints are, that's where I see a good farm plan is really critical. And a good farm plan is a really good description of the soil resources, LUC, landscape. And so the whole farm plans that we've got with that great 1 to 10,000 scale, LUC and soil mapping, can be a really, really valuable resource, not just in terms of identifying environmental risk, but also providing farmers with great information about nutrient management, getting the most out of their soils where it's possible to do so, where they can intensify areas of their farm, where they need to be protecting it, and what protecting it might look like. And so I think we as practitioners often get a bit caught up in all the technicality of it and looking at those very detailed keys, and I can pore over our farm plan and find it really interesting. But if we can then translate that into what matters for farmers, that's super valuable from not just a farm business perspective, but also achieving those win-wins and those environmental outcomes. So in terms of broader opportunities, I'm nearly done, and then I'm more than happy to take questions. I guess at the moment with the freight train that we've got and trying to tackle multiple environmental outcomes at once, there's some big considerations that our farmers are facing, and we're already seeing land use change, significant land use change, and often there's a multitude of drivers that are leading farmers into that, not just chasing the money as people often perceive. So some farmers will be able to make changes within their farm systems, tweaks to policy, and we've seen this over decades and decades of farming in New Zealand, where the farm systems that we have today are quite different to what was here 50 to 100 years ago. And we will see those tweaks and changes continue. I suspect we'll also see a lot of land use diversification, and that, as I said, we're already seeing that, not just at wholesale farm level, though possibly within farm boundaries. And again, if you've got a really good understanding of your base resources, your human resources, your capital resources, and your natural resources, looking at land use options is definitely providing some scope and opportunity for a number of farmers. A key obstacle to overcome there is, I guess, the cultural identity that many of our farmers have with the type of farm system that they're running now. And my husband is a sheep and beef farmer through and through, and finds any conversation about whether we could do arable or horticulture or forestry quite confronting. Whereas we do see other farmers see themselves as land managers. And so whether we see a big cultural shift there or not remains to be seen, but these are ways that we can achieve farming systems that also deliver these fairly significant outcomes on environmental benefit. There are market opportunities, I think, often way overplayed in the media in terms of farmers getting paid more for low environmental footprint food. I think increasingly we'll see it as a ticket to play into our high value markets, as opposed to getting any premium for it. Any premiums are likely to be niche into some of our specific markets or local trade. But but for now there are a few out there, and you can see companies such as Fonterra, Lay, Silver Fern Farms, First Light making some plays into those markets while they can. As I've hopefully pointed out a few examples where you can achieve multiple outcomes for one action, and those are always great, not just for people, confidence people have, but also in terms of achieving win-wins for the environment. And I think the other thing that we're likely to see is more collective solutions, and we see that in Māori agribusiness, where the collective culture is innate, and really good outcomes in terms of broad decisions and approach to land management, and also their communities. So I think we'll see more of that coming through the broader farming community. So I will wrap up just with a summary slide, and then happy to take questions. So taking a whole farm system approach is really about taking a human approach and keeping people at the centre. If we put people at the centre, all of the technical stuff builds around what people need, want, and what they're looking for in terms of long-term management of their farms, businesses, and their homes. You don't need to be a farmer or have a farming background to have a whole farm system approach, but you do need to understand how biological systems work, and knowing some of the intricacies of farm systems that you're dealing with is more likely to lead to success in terms of achieving environmental outcomes. If farmers understand what you're trying to achieve and why, they're very good problem solvers, and they understand their landscapes better than any of us walking onto their farms. If they're given the space and the scope, they'll often come up with really creative solutions. It's really important to manage risk, and obviously that's what many of us do on a daily basis. But we also need to think about how we can manage risk, and often achieving easy wins and building confidence might not seem like the direct route, but will often be more effective and achieve outcomes quicker and at greater scale than you might have otherwise anticipated. In terms of resources, we can't all be experts in every part of a farm system. As I put that illustration up, it's a complex beast. There is a huge range of elements that are all interlinked. So work with experts across different fields to fill the gaps, and don't think you know everything and can be everything to everyone. Collectively, we often can achieve much greater outcomes. And there are opportunities. There is certainly a future for animal agriculture in New Zealand. It will be easier for some than others. But the mindset and the nature of the conversations that we have with people, and farmers in particular, will make a big difference to whether we can achieve positive outcomes for business, for animals, for our communities, and for those people in the environment as well. So I will leave it there, and happy to take questions.